Good afternoon, everyone. Asquequasanumis and Canupiam. Greetings and welcome to our first Lunch and Learn for 2026. I'm your host today, Chrystal Baker, and I thank you for joining us. This free educational series is made possible through the generous support of the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the Pepito Opportunity Connection, the United Way, the Mellon Foundation, Rhode Island Foundation, and community donors like you. We are deeply grateful for your continued support, which allows us to share this educational programming freely with audiences near and far. So this year, our Lunch and Learn series centers on the theme Revolution, Asserting Sovereignty. As the nation reflects on the legacy of the American Revolution, we intentionally widen the lens to foreground Indigenous presence, leadership, and resistance, particularly here in the Southern Dawnland, where Indigenous nations have shaped this land long before the idea of America existed. Throughout the year, we will gather, listen, and reflect and learn from Indigenous voices, recognizing sovereignty not as a moment in history, but as an ongoing practice rooted in land, community, and self-determination. We are honored to begin this year of learning together and look forward to the conversations that will unfold across the series. Before we begin, just a quick reminder to please place yourself on mute. You're welcome to share questions or comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of today's presentation. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for this series, Ned Blackhawk. Ned is the Howard R. Lamar Professor of History at Yale University, where he researches and teaches about Native American and U.S. history. He is co-director of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Certificate in Yale College, faculty coordinator of the Yale Group for the Study of Native America Working Group, and co-director of the NYU Yale American Indian Sovereignty Project, a multi-institutional research and advocacy initiative that aims to redress misunderstandings of federal Indian law and support the scholarly development of American Indian legal history. He's an author and/or co-editor of 5 works in Indigenous studies. His most recent book, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History, won many national awards, including the National Book Award for Nonfiction. A national bestseller, it has been translated into 8 foreign languages and will soon appear in a young adult version with 7 Stories Press. He has recently consulted on Kevin Costner and Doris Kearns Goodin's The West History Channel and the Ken Burns-led production, The American Revolution, which I believe is airing on PBS currently. His current work focuses on the aftermath of the 7 Years' War in British North America and the place of Native nations in the unfolding Revolutionary War, portions of which have been featured and/or are forthcoming in the Boston Globe and the Atlantic. He is an enrolled member of the Timoke tribe of Western Shoshone Indians of Nevada. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Ned.
Thank you, Crystal, for that lengthy and kind introduction and for the invitation to be here this snowy afternoon. I know we all are dealing in the Northeast with challenges related to weather that may have been a little anticipated or unanticipated, but after many years, we can confront these challenges perhaps more effectively. I'm really excited to be here. 2026 has arrived, and the nation's historical community has redirected its attention to the legacies of the founding of the United States. A series of commemorative efforts have occurred or are occurring. National media and intellectual attention is focusing itself on the meanings and legacies of the American Revolution. And I have, my own small kind of role in this process that I'm happy to talk about today. It's a little bit ironic because I never anticipated becoming what is known in the scholarly community as a revolutionary historian. This is among the most studied, obviously, and documented moments in American history, and my scholarly career and interests have always, or initially, focused on Native American history in Western North America, where my community is from and where most of my early works were centered. But over time, my interests have kind of developed and expanded and brought me into kind of more sustained conversation and engagement with these kind of central questions about American history. And in my recent book, The Rediscovery of America, chapter 5 is subtitled The Indigenous Origins of the American Revolution. And I say it's a little ironic because when I wrote that, I had no idea that it might become part of a larger conversation around this time. The book came out in 2023. I probably submitted it in 2021 or 2022, and I wrote those chapters, the early chapters, before the pandemic even occurred. So I wasn't thinking 2026 when this book was being formed. I was really trying to just provide a kind of interpretive overview or synthesis of Native American history, drawing upon a wealth of scholarly findings over the last generation, a wealth of such extraordinary development that I term this kind of scholarly engagement the rediscovery of America, because it's been an extraordinary generative period of Native American historical analysis that has finally brought Native American history much more closely into the center of U.S. historical analysis more broadly. It used to be, as I'm sure you and many others can attest to, it used to be that Native peoples were not seen as central participants in the larger narrative of American history. It used to be that textbooks routinely diminished and discounted the presence of Native peoples upon the North American continent, both before as well as after European contact. There's a famous textbook, the longest running textbook in American history is called The American Pageant. And its initial editor was a Stanford historian by the name of Thomas Bailey. And its first edition came out in 1956. And that textbook, which is now in its 18th edition, is the kind of embodiment of the kind of long-standing Cold War ideas about the exceptional nature of American history and the relative unimportance of Native peoples within it. And as late as the 1980s, that textbook would say routinely things that we would all find kind of shocking. It would undercount Native American populations at the time of European contact so extensively to almost suggest that the continent wasn't uninhabited. It said, this is a direct quote, perhaps 1 million Native peoples lived in North America at the time of European arrival, using terms like wilderness and undeveloped or kind of primitive language of that sort to describe the peoples and kind of civilizations upon the American continent was routine when I started graduate school in the early 90s. And so I've lived through this kind of rediscovery that I'm kind of talking about, and am incredibly dependent and grateful for all the scholars and many tribal community historians and others who really contributed to this new arriving kind of paradigm of the centrality, essentially, of Native peoples to the evolution of American history. So that's what the book generally is um, aiming to do. But there's one chapter, which is part of it's a 12 chapter book. Each chapter kind of brings together literatures that others and sometimes myself have kind of contributed to, and makes these kind of new interpretive perspectives. And the new interpretive perspective that this chapter and the book as a whole kind of make have kind of unsurprised, to me, very surprisingly, have kind of reached into unexpected quarters. And the Burns American Revolution series is kind of the latest or most recent kind of manifestation of this unexpected reach, because the co-director, David Schmidt, was ironically, for those of us in the field, a student at Dartmouth College as an undergraduate, where I think his senior essay advisor was the very famous Native American historian, or the historian of Native America, an English scholar by the name of Colin Calloway. And so David Schmidt is the co-director of the American Revolution, alongside Ken Burns, and he brought this interest of bringing Native Americans into this production. And it's not perfect, and I know it's disappointing to have limited, for example, Narragansett visibility in this production. But compared to those earlier narratives that we were discussing from the 80s and throughout the 20th century, the Burns production makes a very strong effort to bring Native American history into its visions of the founding of the United States in a way that the scholarly community and the museum community and very particularly the K through 12 educational world has been insufficiently able to do. So how do they do it? They look at the aftermath of the Seven Years' War in 1763, when British North America acquires the former vast colony of New France from the French Empire or monarchy. British North America more than doubles in size in 1763, and this moment of triumphant, kind of euphoric achievement for the British Empire makes it literally the largest empire in world history. And this battle, which I examine, or this larger war, known as the Seven Years' War, sometimes still referred to as the French and Indian War. This war begins in the interior world of Eastern North America, in the overlapping kind of borderlands regions between New France and British North America, with many indigenous peoples involved. So you cannot understand that conflict at all, its origins, its course, and even its conclusion, without understanding the centrality of indigenous peoples to this imperial conflict. So when the war ends, Britain is by far the most powerful and expansive empire in world history. You could walk from the now acquired West Floridian Panhandle territory of British Florida to the Hudson Bay in northern Canada and stay within the realm of lands claimed by the British Crown. That's how extensive this empire has become. And the British government knows, however, that across that interior world that they had just fought and acquired, native peoples were still powerful and determinative in so many ways. And so the irony for the British is that over the next 12 months, the native peoples of the region make peace in many ways more costly than war had been. Because the war is over officially. The last French surrender is actually in December of 1760 at Detroit. The great battles of the 1759 include the kind of conquest of Quebec and then the fall of Montreal thereafter. These are the largest battles in North American history until the American Civil War. And so American historians have never sufficiently, I think, registered the kind of global dimensions of this period of American history, and let alone recognize the centrality of indigenous peoples to that process. Because after this war is over, after the French surrender, after they turn over their swords, and after they essentially, many of the leaders return to France and the armies become demobilized, the British attempt a process of demobilization also, but also an attempt to kind of administer and kind of institute new policies in these interior worlds. And at places like Detroit, the indigenous peoples are not going to respond well to British imperial demands that don't come along with various forms of diplomatic recognition, economic and trade supplies or gifts, as the British used to call them, and other kind of requisite forms of inner societal diplomacy, essentially. And so, after several long, frustrating years of General Amherst's efforts to kind of demobilize, to on the one hand, demobilize this larger army, as well as institute new policies over Indians, especially in the interior, Native peoples rebel. And this kind of confederacy, known as Pontiac's Confederacy, emerges in the summer of 1763 and destabilizes this region entirely. British settlers flee east to colonial settlements. Nine of the 13 forts that the British have inherited from the French are, in fact, destroyed by Pontiac and related Algonquian-speaking peoples. Many of the remaining forts, like Detroit and Michilimackinac, are laid siege to by Pontiac and his warriors, and essentially the region is descending back into warfare. And this is the last thing that both the crown as well as its settler subjects want to happen. And so the crown responds in ways that make sense to it by reaching diplomatic accords. They pass that fall after the summer of 1763. Conflicts erupt. They pass in October the proclamation line of 1763 that prohibits British settlement in this interior world. And they begin a process essentially of trying to renegotiate with Pontiac and the Confederacy leaders new terms of passage and agreements about resource distributions and things that the French had long been famous for doing. Um, so that's what the crown does, but its settlers respond differently. They get fearful. They're worried that they've seen the British Army demobilized throughout the early 1760s. They remember the conflicts that had plagued the region beforehand. And most importantly, they had been anticipating, once the French were driven from North America, access to French lands, into French resources, into the worlds that the French nominally claimed, but were in fact controlled by indigenous peoples. So across the Appalachian frontier, settlers are essentially eyeing these lands and resources, but being prohibited from acquiring them. Why are they being prohibited? Because the British Crown is attempting to administer a transition from war to peace that doesn't descend the region into chaos. Britain, as the American Revolution film makes very clear, has 26 colonies in the Western Hemisphere. They've inherited so many more. Now have Canada. They're governing places that are cold. They have new Caribbean colonies. They're trying to essentially administer this sprawling, vast hemispheric empire. I think it also includes the Falkland Islands now. So they have literally a kind of hemispheric empire for the first time across the Western Hemisphere that the British North America is just one part of. And these settlers were not very many in 1763, I think 1.8, perhaps 2 million total, are eyeing this interior world. And so series of conflicts. I write about these militias that form. They start targeting Native peoples. They get suspicious of them, and a discourse of kind of racial animosity starts forming. And so throughout the 1760s, long before the Boston Massacre, even before the Stamp Act and other related kind of anti-tax mobilizations occur, interior settlers are organizing against British politics and policies. They lay siege to forts that are trading with Indians. They interdict supply trains. They burn resources that are intended to, kind of help grease the wheels of diplomacy and trade in the interior. And most kind of dramatically, they start massacring peaceful Indian peoples whom they think are ferrying either resources or information to Pontiac. And this kind of anti-indigenous ideology starts forming in a big way. And it happens here and in this period. It's not kind of been a two-century formation that started with the first British travelers to the Chesapeake or with even the kind of failed Roanoke colonies. It wasn't there in the first Puritan settlements in the early 1600s. This kind of anti-indigenous ideology that conflates all Native peoples as being racially different, and the term that's in the Declaration, merciless Indian savages, that term embodies this growing animosity and racialization that is hardening in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. And that reflects a kind of growing political economy that the settler societies, particularly in places like Western Pennsylvania, Western New York State, Western Virginia, down into the Carolinas, they're anticipating access into these interior lands, and they're deeply frustrated that the crown is prohibiting them. So much so that these are central, not incidental, variables in the unfolding conflict between with the monarchy and its settlers. And so I term this conflict, or these kind of types of tensions, the indigenous origins of the American Revolution. And it's not just colonists fighting Indians, it's colonists fighting British governors and armies and leaders in ways that American historians have kind of brushed aside or not sufficiently attended to. So if you think about that subject as you're watching or seeing the PBS Burns production, you'll see that Burns and Schmidt and um, the other co-director are incorporating these ideas and these concerns. And they enlisted myself and Colin Calloway I mentioned and others across into these early episodes. And they make this very strong claim that Indian land is at the center of the growing conflict between the colonists and the crown, and thus the revolution in part is initiated over concerns about access to the interior world. That is a big scholarly and interpretive reorientation from the previous generation of scholarship or two, let alone the kind of Cold War traditions that Bailey and others established. It's perhaps the first national recognition of the centrality of indigenous peoples to the course of the American Revolution in a kind of nationally public way. And so we're not deeply all satisfied with that production. It is a kind of military history of the war largely itself, and doesn't talk at great length about the legacies of this challenging subject, particularly for Native peoples, the legacies of which are still with us. That language of racialization, the kind of animosity of 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 assumed savagery. Not only is it kind of hardening in this period, it's actually at odds with long-standing ties between uh, colonial societies and native peoples within them. Hundreds of Indian peoples fight on behalf of the colonies during the Revolutionary conflict. Over 100 are died, and particularly in and around the battles of New York. So there is a under-recognized history to this subject that still requires academic and kind of scholarly excavation and re-engagement. And perhaps there's a kind of space for a kind of larger, broader national conversation about what the Declaration means now in 2026, and how do we teach each other and our children and maybe future children about the still kind of lingering and evident language of objectification and vilification that's still found at the bottom in the last grievance of the Declaration. I'm happy to keep talking about the kind of subject of Native peoples in the Revolution, but I wonder if there seem to be a few questions that are kind of forming that I'd also be happy to respond to.
Can you speak about the Haudenosaunee Iroquois input for the U.S. Constitution and any other involvement in the American Revolution?
That's a great question from Melissa. There is a unresolved academic debate between academic historians and Native American studies scholars about the degree to which the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy influenced the constitutional um, formations of the United States. It was more um, visible. It was a more visible or kind of animated academic conversation in the late 90s. And it kind of died down, but I think it's coming back in part because of the revolutionary moment of commemoration that we're in. So, um, scholars in Native American history and students know pretty well that prior to European contact across particularly upstate New York and Eastern Canada, sets of indigenous communities became organized around new principles and new visions of both peace but also governance. And these communities came together and built a confederacy among five nations who sent delegates annually to a kind of confederated annual gathering, drawing from the clans of each respective community. It really became a kind of united nations of Iroquois or Haudenosaunee peoples. Um, that confederacy became extraordinarily influential throughout the 1600s, and deeply impacted the evolution of both French and British colonial histories. So much so that even the French monarch at Versailles, Louis the 14th, the Sun King, he sends 1,000 of his best troops in 1665 to come to North America to help defeat this confederacy, given their power and influence. They're unsuccessful, but a detente follows thereafter. So the Haudenosaunee are very recognizable historically, but also at the both in the kind of scholarly literature, but also at the time. And so the film mentions that Franklin is in Albany for something that he attempted to organize or co-organize called the Albany Conference in 1754. That's happening right as the Seven Years' War is beginning, and thus limits its potential to bring the colonies together in a kind of larger organized confederacy or confederated form. And he mentions how impressed he is by the Iroquois people at this conference, who come from these kind of different but still united communities. And he writes about it somewhat extensively in his writings. Um, that kind of indicates the kind of growing recognition, both among the colonists, of their need to kind of create a larger governing um, structure between the colonies, but also their understanding that there are nearby kind of political confederated communities. So there is a kind of undeniable sense that founding figures like Washington, like Franklin, and others, particularly those from the North, knew and understood the power of indigenous political organizations, and thus the kind of possibilities of growth or power through those types of unified efforts. The argument is, to what extent? To what extent are these um, indigenous uh, powers or polities impactful in the actual structure and thinking of the federalist system that emerges? Those debates have been going for a while. I'm not deeply immersed in them. I don't have a really strong kind of argumentative side to take, but I do think it's not a question of of whether, but to what extent. So there's another question. What's the greatest emphasis for teachers to give their students around this subject? Okay. Um, I would say that one of the I try to work with teachers as much as I can. My mom was a longstanding high school teacher. And you guys do extraordinary, valuable work in society. And so thank you on behalf of, of, of so many for the hard labor that constitutes teaching on a K through 12 basis. Generally, the challenge of doing Native American history is to recognize the misunderstandings that have been passed down and to redress them in some forms. And so one of the misunderstandings is that all Native Americans are the same. And that kind of homogenization, that kind of a sense of kind of shared, kind of racialized kind of identity is one of the kind of enduring legacies of the revolution itself, of the Declaration. If we were to say merciless Indian savages is the kind of term of understanding that the founders projected for Native peoples, that's a kind of a form of not just kind of racialized animosity, but a clear form of homogenization that means that these Indians are all not only savage, but they're all the same, essentially. That, the Abenaki of New England are similar to the Cherokee of the Carolinas, or the Seminole of Florida are related or similar somehow to the Ojibwe of Wisconsin. That's difficult as a Native person, as a kind of scholar, as people interested in specificity, evidence-based analysis, or kind of informed understandings, that's hard because Native peoples are not the same. And there are, over 560 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Uh, um, and so both historically and contemporarily, there's a diversity of Native America that needs to be kind of understood and recognized. That's not to say that there are similarities, and one of the most kind of enduring similarities is the shared experience of being treated by the federal government in certain ways, having your children maybe taken to boarding schools, having your lands dispossessed, having federal administrative oversight placed upon your communities, your languages and religions persecuted. Those are kind of shared experiences that do make Native peoples kind of similar in sense, historically or experientially. So that's the kind of a beginning point. It's also very important to bring in local Native subject matters and peoples and leaders and voices into one's kind of engagements with these subjects. It doesn't make sense to have the Lakota of the Northern Plains stand in for all of Native peoples, especially if you live in the Northeast or the Northwest coast of the United States. So having a certain not only understanding of the diversity of Native America, but the particular regional or kind of local familiarity with one's own kind of regional or geography.
We do have another question. So, with your involvement in others, why is the new Ken Burns documentary not more accurate about the significance of Native Americans?
Um, it's uh, it's less accurate in the sense that it doesn't spend as much time with each of its subjects as it could. Like I said earlier, I'm less kind of um, concerned about the kind of particular problems it has uh, than the kind of general openings that it provides. The general openings it provides offer kind of possibilities of engagement that at least the academic historians generally have had a hard time doing. I can understand the failure to carry forward the narrative. It really is only in the first two or three episodes that the subject matter really centers on Native peoples. And of course, there's a kind of deeply celebratory um, assessment of the culmination of the revolutionary struggle. So I don't think there are a few, as Lauren Spears and I were talking about, I think last week or a week and a half ago. There are some clear ways in which the inaccuracies around Native participation, particularly of Northeastern Native communities, it still endures in the film. And I think I'm forward to learning more about those problems with her and through others' published works in my own kind of engagements. So I think one could spend time delineating the kind of problems or the inaccuracies of the production. But I would encourage people to do so with the understanding that rather than throwing out the baby with the bathwater, that we keep the kind of interventions that the project does make in front of us to understand kind of what it's working up against.
So, as a historian, have you ever loosely chronicled what you think the indigenous population would look like and evolve had there not been European interference? I often think about that myself.
I haven't spent a lot of time chronicling it in the terms of the question, but I have also thought about it. And Early career scholars sometimes come to their subjects with a sense of kind of counterfactual um, interest to kind of try to understand something somewhat in the kind of hypothetical or counterfactual. And you kind of look through American history and you kind of see these hinges or these pivots or these kind of moments where you kind of wonder, as you learn more about the subject, you start thinking less about this question, what would but then you start thinking more about particular questions. What would have happened had Washington been defeated in Brooklyn, for example? What would North America look like had the American Revolution not succeeded? Those are the types of questions that are more kind of involved in a sense because they initiate a kind of engagement with a set of specific um, counterfactual or questions that like kind of lead to other questions. There's a kind of analytical or interpretive um, challenge that can have. The general question, if Columbus hadn't sailed in October of 1492, what would have happened? That would have been, or September of 1492, that would have been um, um, you know, uh, a question of, extraordinary kind of implications that almost defies kind of speculation. I just taught the Columbian Exchange, as it's called the other day, and the kind of legacies of this Columbian encounter are so extensive that it's hard to kind of underestimate. So, but one could say if Cortez had not conquered this Aztec or Manoa Empire, had the French not lost the Seven Years' War, there's all these kind of possible kind of channel outcomes that for Native American history provides lots of avenues of at least conversation, if not insight. Okay, there's a next question about, let's see, Jeremy Dennis. Are there any notable responses from the last 50-year commemoration of the Declaration in art or events that came across your, there's a surprising amount of American Indian uh, protests in 1976 against the bicentennial. And it wasn't really against celebrating America as a kind of subject matter, but more about the under recognition of Native peoples in American society and history. And so it's really kind of a long-standing kind of criticism or intellectual critique that Native peoples have levied against America and its historians, saying for well over 150 years, your visions of yourself don't reflect how you've treated us, and don't reflect the actual subject matters that you claim they do. And so there's a kind of nonfiction intellectual history of Native American criticisms of American historical understanding that were evident in 1893 at the Chicago Columbian Exposition, or at the time, I think the world's largest kind of cultural gathering, if not certainly America's largest cultural gathering, in which over 20 million people attended this famous exposition in Chicago. There are American Indian critiques of of American kind of exceptionalism that grows in the Cold War era. There's long-standing kind of concerns that Native peoples have had about the the kind of failure to see Native peoples within American history. But you asked for kind of specific examples in art. There's this going on a new Indian art movement out of New Mexico in the 60s and 70s. Fritz Shoulder has a kind of bicentennial Indian lithograph that is somewhat well known. He's a Native American artist from that period. Um, the kind of nonfiction critiques often have the subtitle manifesto in them. So there's this manifesto from Vine Deloria Jr. called Custer Died for Your Sins, in which he critiques what he calls the cameo theory of American history, where just periodically Native peoples and other minorities pop up and make a brief cameo to suggest that American history has been sufficiently kind of comfortable for them, which it really hasn't for Native American peoples. So there are a lot of kind of particular examples that one could point to. Uh, I would recommend The Rediscovery of America. The last two chapters are on the 20th century and kind of cover some of these subjects more deeply.
We do have a couple more questions. Thaddeus Gamery asks, was William Penn's relationship with Lenape people of Delaware a healthy, honorable model of coexistence of independent nations, or was he only creating trusting relationships that could be easily exploited at later times?
Um, Penn's relationship with local native peoples in the late 1600s in Pennsylvania did provide a different model than the other British colonies. I don't think the kind of subsequent question about whether the model itself was intended to deceive or potentially dispossess native peoples is as helpful as just understanding the distinctions of the colonial society that forms across particularly the first half of the 1700s in Pennsylvania. This is a very legally pluralistic and religiously tolerant place, comparatively speaking, compared to, say, Massachusetts or even the Chesapeake. Massachusetts and Virginia are the two largest colonies in British North America. The first seven presidents or the first six presidents of the United States come from those two colonies or former colonies. So it's there; those legacies still endure. But in Pennsylvania, there are all kinds of Swedish and German and Mennonite and all differential kind of religious communities that have formed, and partly because of the more evidently tolerant forms of cultural acceptance that the early governors, like the Penn family, established. That's why what happens during the Seven Years' War is so kind of shocking because it's in Pennsylvania that the biggest massacre of the Conestoga Indians occurs in November of 1763. And it shocks people like Benjamin Franklin, who's a legislator in Philadelphia, that to see their kind of local white neighbors become so racially violent, essentially, against peaceful native peoples. And that's one of the big transitions that happens during this decade before the revolution formally is established is the transformation of people like Franklin, like Washington, and other kind of Federalist leaders, eventually known as Federalist leaders, who were never kind of accepting of lawless vigilantism. They hated mob rule. This is the antithesis of what republicanism or democratic theories of self-representation were supposed to come from. And so this tension between classes and between segments of society, Indian affairs often expose them. But somehow, those tensions became diminished over time. And someone like Franklin could sign the Declaration, even though in 1764 he condemned deeply and at length these kind of settler militias that had formed the previous year. And he lost his seat as a legislator in the subsequent election that fall because he wasn't sufficiently attentive to these growing hostilities that were forming. So it's a very complex subject matter.
Yeah. So, and Wanianatsu Lam Kason asks, says, you mentioned not originally intending to become a revolutionary historian. Was there a moment in your research on the era when Indigenous presence or decision making fundamentally changed how you understood the period?
Um, yes, I'm not sure. It's less of a particular moment, but just a growing realization that, in part because the claims that I'm making, other people have also made. They just haven't formulated them in the same ways. And so I'm bringing together the ideas of many people when I say things like the indigenous origins of the American Revolution, or in the aftermath of the Seven Years' War, interior native policies shaped the emergence of a settler kind of militia culture. That's really a few people, like a guy named Patrick Spiro and others. So basically, what I'm saying is I'm not the one swimming in the archives every day, looking for source materials, and but I'm reading other people's works, and so I teach them, I read them, I review them, and so after doing this for so long, I started realizing there are these patterns that are forming, and so if you really want to know the moment where the light bulb kind of really went off is when I saw a map, which I reproduced in the Rediscovery of America, thankfully. a map of the Seven Years' War, and it was in a book by a very I've never met him, but I've come to know that he is a very kind of traditional historian of colonial military history, and his name is Fred Anderson. And the book came out a long time ago, 20 years ago, but sometimes it takes that long for those ideas to kind of disseminate. But in this book he wrote called Crucible of War, there's a map of the Seven Years' War that shows that it began with George Washington's efforts to drive the French fort of Duquesne away from what becomes Pittsburgh. And the war then goes all over literally the world into England, into continental Europe, into the English colonies, across the French Mediterranean. And this war just kind of becomes unprecedented. And the map shows that. And the war's origins start in the interior of North America, and they end even further with Pontiac's War, which Anderson calls the last theater of the Seven Years' War. So that map told me when I read it 15 years ago or something that there was this history here about the 18th century world in which Native peoples were central, but at the time and still now are insufficiently recognized as determinate variables. It's like a kind of formula that has not included these subjects. So um, I the light bulb started going off. I said, okay, I want to be in this conversation. And Anderson, just to let you know how important sometimes ideas and scholarship can be, he says in this book called Crucible of War, which is like 900 pages long, he says the Seven Years' War is the most important war of the 18th century. So, unlike Ken Burns, who says the American Revolution is the most important event in human history since the birth of Christ, Anderson is saying that Seven Years' War beforehand is the war that shaped the evolution of the American revolutionary struggle. So, these are interpretive differences, but it's almost like the way scholars have come to see eventually the First World War and the Second World War as inherently related subjects. That's starting to happen with the American Revolution. That scholars like Anderson and others have kind of made the Seven Years' War a necessary beginning. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to participate in, and the kind of continued recognition that this period can't just be understood in kind of conventional time periods or conventional actors and areas. And so the Burns series does kind of fall back a little bit into that traditional format, but it makes enough gesture to this other subject that I think those paying attention can see it.
I think one last question.
Okay.
So this one's just in general. In your research as a historian, what has been the most enlightening or impactful finding you've had? Now, I know you've done a lot of research. That's why I
Hmm.
said in general,
Okay.
what would you say?
Um, uh, I can't name of nothing immediately jumps up and down, but I would say that and I tell my students this fairly often that once you learn how to do one thing, it's once you learn how to do something, it's a lot easier to do it again. But until you learn how to do something, it's very hard to do it. And so early on in my career, there were times where I couldn't quite put things together, both on the page and in my own mind. And there was just a lot of uncertainty, which is true of most graduate students and what we call junior faculty members. But over time, you kind of grow in your own sense of your own convictions. Maybe you teach something, you say something at a conference, you hear someone say something, and you start saying, okay, so I would go back to my early first book called Violence of the Land, which was my dissertation in graduate school at the University of Washington. And the dissertation was a subject, as a portion of what became the larger book. And the larger book required a lot more work than the dissertation, like a lot more. And so it took me many years. But eventually I kind of said, okay, I have to make the bigger book more than the dissertation. and I started reading in pretty familiar subjects to Western historians. The book is about the American Great Basin and the Shoshone-speaking peoples of Colorado, Utah, and Nevada, including the Western Shoshone, my tribe. And so I realized when I was reading these conventional subjects that they too, like the revolutionary subjects we've been discussing, had been kind of left off the map, literally, or kind of swept under the rug, or so, whatever metaphor. And it turns out the whole history of the Lewis and Clark expedition required Shoshone-speaking assistance throughout its travels. And so I sat down with the then published journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition and just started finding these choice examples and kind of illuminating them in a way that convinced me that this subject belonged in this analysis. And Lewis and Clark are the most famous explorers in American history. Their map is the most famous map in American history. They're like the beginning of Western history for so many narratives. And so I kind of was able to bring my interest into this well-established subject. And it may not have been like that transformative, but it convinced me that I could keep going and make subsequent arguments along side that one. So that's kind of the kind of piecemeal growth of scholarly development occurs often in these very kind of incidental, seemingly ways.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I think we've come almost to the end. If there's no last burning
Good.
questions,
We can all go finish shoveling our driveways.
we can do that. So thank you, Ned, definitely for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Know that this presentation will be available on our YouTube page for those of you who wish to revisit or even share it. We hope you'll join us next month as we continue our Lunch and Learn series, Revolution, Asserting Sovereignty, and carry this conversation forward together. We hope that you have a lovely afternoon. Stay warm. Don't shovel too hard. And enjoy the rest of your day. Peace Kanash, everyone.
Thank you.